Jy luister na RSG Geldsaake met Moneyweb potgoeie met gasheer Ryk van die Kerk. RSG Geldsaake met Moneyweb, jou betroubare bron vir sake en beleggingsinsigte.
Ek het Vrydag aand met Johan Gous van Sasfin gesels oor die ANC wat in sy verkiesingsmanifest aangekondig het dat pensioenfondse verplig kan word om in infrastruktuur te belê. Hierdie praktyk staan algemeen bekend as voorgeskrewe bates. Die party het eers die idee van voorgeskrewe bates in sy 2019 manifest ingesluit en gesê die moontlikheid daarvan moet ondersoek word, maar die jongste manifest sê dit is nou die regering se amptelike beleid. Zuko Godlimpi is op die lyn, hy is die adjunkvoorsitter van die ANC se ekonomiese transformasie komitee. Zuko, thank you so much for your time. Just please explain what the ANC intends with this policy. What is it aimed at?
The context, of course, is the point that you were making as lifted from the text. The objective of this policy is to increase the levels of investment in the South African economy in line with the ambitions to revitalize our industrial capabilities, boost manufacturing output, and create mass employment. So that's essentially what we are trying to go for. And that depends on raising the aggregate investment level that is available in the economy and directing investment capital to specific sectors of the economy that are critical for our industrialization agenda.
But is the way to do that to force pension funds to invest in this project?
The forcing part, no one is going to force anybody to do anything. Reopen the conversation with the pensions industry as it has happened before, including the latest amendment in the Pension Funds Act, which was in 2022. So the intention is not to arbitrarily take a decision about which class of assets to be invested in or to even design those, but is to have a broad conversation with all the relevant stakeholders to pose the question about whether the ambitions for national growth that we all share could be better realized with an increased threshold of domestic investment from our pension funds sector, which before you raise it, the question would be then why did you allow Regulation 28 to be amended the way it was in 2022? And the answer is, given what I just explained as our industrial ambition, the lifting of the threshold that happened in 2022 was a bit counterintuitive, but it was done as an attempt to respond to the exigent moment that arose as a product of the unimagined COVID-19 lockdown that it did and the impact that it had on investment. So an attempt to sort of stabilize everyone's portfolio growth. But we are now saying, okay, that has happened. Why are we not having another conversation about, is that in the interest of South Africa's long-run growth? So that is what we're doing. It's not to compel anybody, but to reignite the conversation about how best to improve South Africa's prospects going forward.
Yeah, the Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act was changed in 2022, as you've said, and it allows pension funds to invest up to 45% of their funds in infrastructure projects. But you say the intention is not to compel or force funds to invest in these projects. But clearly the policy in the manifesto states the ANC will engage and direct financial institutions to invest a portion of their funds, because I think many people see that word direct. So can you maybe just describe exactly what you mean the ANC will engage and direct financial institutions to invest in these projects?
And I want us to read that word in context. It says to engage and direct. So the point about direction is, if you say, for instance, if you lower the threshold of how much domestic money is allowed to be invested offshore, if that agreement as a part of engagement is found and then an amendment is placed again on Regulation 28, that is where the direction is, because it will be putting a ceiling. So as long as you have a prescription, even if that prescription is arrived at as a function of negotiation and compromise, once it is a matter of law, it essentially serves as a directive that this is the prescribed amount that is allowed to do this and that. But that direct must not be read to mean an arbitrary compulsion. It will be a direction as a function of an amendment in law arrived at as a product of engagement. So the text must be read as engage and then eventually direct as a function of that agreement out of negotiation with the pensions industry.
But the pensions industry is quite alarmed at this because it seems as if the economy is in a state it's in because of government mismanagement, and there is definitely apprehension to invest in Transnet and Eskom, for example, because there's been a lot of mismanagement and corruption, and then it becomes really uncomfortable for the industry when there are words used like direct, because it may imply forcing these funds to invest in Transnet and Eskom, and if they don't want to.
And again, that's one of the misinterpretations that has been trending. The conversation is not even about forcing people to exclusively invest in government bonds as such. And we've been trying to explain this point that it's not just about an infrastructure class of assets related to SOEs, but it's a conversation about including other privately held assets, but that are critical to South Africa's long-term growth. Let me give an example, for instance, about the current status that Regulation 28 does allow pension funds to pursue, and some of the sentiments that have been raised, by industry. If you recall, before the 2022 amendment, the ceiling on offshore investments was at 35%. It was hiked to 45% now, right? That's the first point. And one of the sentiments raised by people was that, allow that increase, that 10% change to happen so that portfolios can then go towards global industries, and many of which are in the technologies and innovation platform. Now, flip that on its head and say, if South Africa is to improve its economic structure and performance over the long run, we need an increase in investment in technologies and innovations as well. Not just state-owned ones, not assets held by the state, but also held by the domestic private sector that is diversifying towards those areas. But central to that then will have to be an availability of capital to sustain those innovations. And that is what the conversation is about. It's not just about government bonds, but it is about availing an increased quantity of capital, including for the South African emerging private sector in critical technologies. We will still have to have a broad conversation with the pension industry to arrive at a common understanding about which asset classes we're talking about, so that we clarify this confusion that it is about Eskom and Transnet. It's not just about those. It is about a wide range of asset classes, including asset classes that are privately held.
The Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, made similar remarks a while ago and said it was unfortunate that the South African funds are investing offshore and that money could have been used here more productively. But it's a functional field in many ways. But do you foresee a change to Regulation 28 to reduce the foreign exposure local funds may have?
Yes, sitting where I'm sitting, I think it's a necessary conversation that we should have and reevaluate our position in that regard. I think it's in the interest of the domestic economy for us to increase the availability of South African savings for South African domestic investment. And in any case, and this is the point that we usually don't have, it doesn't stand to reason that the domestic investment does not have a relationship with global economics as well. If South African firms that we invest in are also engaged in global trade and they increase their global footprint, we essentially therefore benefit from global economic dynamics as well, in much the same way that we would if we're saying let's invest directly in foreign-owned assets, except when we invest directly in foreign-owned assets, we forego the possibility of building South African employment and therefore growing South Africa's income distribution capacity as well. So we have to have that conversation and consider another amendment to Regulation 28. But here's the point that must be understood. The pensions industry is not going to wake up one day and be told that there's been an amendment to Regulation 28. It will not be some arbitrary movement. It will be a conversation, a painstaking conversation that will not happen overnight, but it's a conversation that must be had and a reform that people must be willing to understand the logic underpinning it.
Ons sal dit daarmee los. Dankie Zuko, dit was Zuko Godlimpi. Hy is die adjunkvoorsitter van die ANC se ekonomiese transformasie komitee. Ja, Theo, die beleid is baie duidelik in die manifesto uiteengesit. Hulle gaan konsulteer en dan direct. Ek weet nie heeltemal hoekom hulle daai woord gebruik het nie, maar dit is maar verplig. En ek weet nie of dit nou maar net verkiesingsbeloftes is nie en of hier regtig iets agter dit insteek nie.
Ryk, ek dink ons moet besef dat hierdie is al 'n tipe van 'n beleid wat kom en gaan in die ANC manifesto die laaste klompie verkiesings. Maar is absoluut tragies as dit moet gebeur. Onthou, as 'n fondsbestuurder is jy verantwoordelik teenoor die ouens wat jou belê, die ouens wat wie se geld jy bestuur. En jy wil 'n risiko aangepaste opbrengs vir daai mense probeer kry. En as die regering nou sê, hulle forceer jou in goed wat jy andersins nie sou gedoen het nie, dan moet 'n mens ernstige vrae vra. Nou goed, wat jy moet onthou, hierdie is die pensioenfondsbedryf. Jy wil graag as belegger in 'n pensioenfonds die voordeel kry van die belastingreëls wat die regering vir jou gee, so die regering kan seker terme daarin stel, want dan staan jou vry om buite onthou die pensioenfondsbedryf en annuïteite is niks anders as 'n stel reëls nie. En as jy daai reëls nakom, as jy daai reëls tot jou voordeel wil gebruik, die belastingreëls, is daar voorskrifte. Maar nogtans, om jou te forceer dat daai fonds sekere goed moet doen, is maar net weer terug, die in Suid-Afrika is enige iets waar die regering betrokke is in intensiewe sorg, en hierdie is nou maar 'n manier om dit uit te kry, maar ek dink nie mense kan daarmee saamstem nie. Ek hoop net, hierdie ouens gaan besef is hulle geld waarvan jy praat.
Jy het geluister na RSG Geldsaake met Moneyweb potgoeie elke weeksdag om 7 namiddag. Vir meer Moneyweb potgoeie, besoek moneyweb.co.za of laai die toepassing af en volg Moneyweb News om dagliks op hoogte te bly.